About History series, the Qing Empire's early strategies for governing Taiwan.
Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're unpacking a truly, absolutely fascinating case study in history. It's a wild story about how deep-seated government paranoia, combined with, well, a complete lack of understanding, can essentially engineer chaos and systemic corruption. We're going to look at the Qing Dynasty's early rule in Taiwan. And trust me on this, the policies they actually implemented are completely mind-boggling when you look at them through a modern lens. Okay, let's dive right into this. To really understand this era, we have to start with a bizarre historical paradox. Seriously, what exactly happens when a massive empire conquers a land, only to spend the next 6 months intensely debating whether they should just completely abandon it? I mean, think about that. The Qing Dynasty defeated the Tungning Kingdom back in 1683, but they definitely didn't do it out of territorial ambition. They were frankly terrified of the island. So that brings us to Section 1, the reluctant annexation. Let's move to and see how this builds over time. The Qing government was almost entirely ignorant of Taiwan's economic potential. To them, it wasn't a prize, it was just a massive headache waiting to happen. You see, they conquered the Tungning Kingdom in 1683, but it took a whole year until 1684 for them to reluctantly, and I mean really reluctantly, annex Taiwan into their official territory. They adopted this incredibly passive, almost neglectful approach to governing. And as you'll see, this extremely avoidant attitude totally dictated everything until a massive wake-up call hit them in 1722. Now, when the Qing finally set up their administration, they mostly just copy-pasted the previous regime's layout. To put this into a modern perspective for us, they established 3 main counties. You had Zulua, which corresponds to modern-day Chiayi, then there was Taiwan County, situated right in modern-day Tainan, and finally Fengshan, located in what is now the Zuling district of Kaohsiung. But here's the catch. Just because you draw counties on a map doesn't mean you actually rule the island. Far from it. The area they truly controlled was tiny. It's like a giant puzzle where they only held one small corner. Everything north of Zwalio was firmly Pingpu tribe territory. And the entire eastern region, which is modern Ilan, Hualien, and Taidong, was known as Hoshan, or the Back Mountain. Out there was absolutely zero Han Chinese footprint. I mean, literally zero. It was a massive, sprawling island, and the mighty Qing Empire was basically just hiding in a tiny corner of it. Moving on to Section 2, a bureaucracy of paranoia. Because they only controlled that tiny sliver of land, the Qing administration's mindset shifted away from actual governance and straight into pure dread. They looked at Taiwan and just saw a historical haven for pirates and a potential breeding ground for anti-Qing rebellions. But above all, the Manchu-led government had zero trust, none, in the Han Chinese officials they sent over to administer the island. Every single policy they wrote was essentially a strict defensive measure designed to prevent their own people from establishing any kind of foothold. So, naturally, they put limits in place. Officially, the Qing mandated a strict 3-year term limit for civil and military officials in Taiwan. The paranoid logic here was simple. If you stay longer, you might team up with the locals and start a rebellion. But actually, scratch that. It wasn't even 3 full years. Nature literally dictated their policy. You see, officials had to ride the northeast monsoon winds to arrive, and they had to wait for the summer winds to sail back to the mainland. So functionally, because of the weather, that 3-year term was restricted to just 2.5 years of actual time on the island. Which leads perfectly into Section 3, institutionalized corruption. So let's think about this for a second. What happens when you create an entire system built on paranoia and incredibly short timelines? Well, you get structural incentives that go completely off the rails. Bureaucrats had that painfully short-term limit, right? But it gets worse. The government explicitly forbade officials from bringing their families to Taiwan. Your family was essentially held hostage on the mainland to guarantee you behaved. But to sweeten this, frankly, miserable deal, the government offered a massive carrot. If you simply survived your term in Taiwan without a rebellion breaking out, boom, you were guaranteed a promotion back in the safer, wealthier mainland provinces. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it generated a rather dark historical proverb. Travel 1,000 miles to be an official just for wealth. Because these guys were only there for 2.5 years, couldn't bring their families, and knew they were leaving soon anyway, nobody cared about actual governance at all. It was purely a transit mentality. Taiwan became the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme. What was supposed to be a miserable, dangerous post became this highly sought-after gig for corrupt officials who just wanted to swoop in, extort the locals, line their pockets, and catch the very next boat out. It's basically the worst management practice imaginable. And the sheer neglect that came from this was staggering. Remember those rural counties we mentioned earlier, like Chiayi and Kaohsiung? The magistrates, known as zijian, who were assigned to govern them, flat out refused to actually live there. They chose to stay in the comfort and relative safety of the administrative center down in Tainan instead. They were literally acting as absentee landlords. So you had these rural government offices completely devoid of actual leaders, resulting in absolute zero administrative efficiency. Section 4. The broken military system. So the civil administration was a mess, but the military was a complete disaster waiting to happen. The Qing relied on what's called the Benbing system, which was a rotational military deployment. And because Taiwanese locals were strictly banned from serving in the military, the empire rotated troops in from the mainland. They specifically designed the whole system so soldiers could never, ever establish roots, form local loyalties, or build any sort of power base. The actual mechanics of the system were incredibly strict. Just like the bureaucrats, soldiers had a 3-year maximum deployment. And yep, their families were strictly forbidden from joining them too. But the most paranoid rule of all was the strict segregation. The Qing deliberately enacted this intense divide-and-conquer strategy. For example, if a soldier originally came from Zhangzhou on the mainland, they were legally banned from being deployed in a Taiwanese district that was populated by Zhangzhou immigrants. It was 100% designed to prevent the military and the civilians from ever making friends or colluding. So what do you think the result was? On paper, the Qing required these rotated soldiers to be stable, respectable men who owned property. In reality, though, because corruption was running so rampant, the slots were often filled by outlaws and mercenaries. You basically had thousands of unsupervised, undisciplined men completely separated from their families with zero ties to the local community. Instead of keeping the peace, these soldiers essentially became the mafia. They ran illegal businesses, they protected gambling dens and brothels, and they violently oppressed the very citizens they were supposed to protect. The military itself became the primary source of lawlessness and riots. Which brings us to a question that will absolutely baffle anyone who studies military history. Let's think about this. Why would an empire, deeply terrified of rebellions and pirates, deliberately leave its own administrative centers in Taiwan completely defenseless? Section 5. Cities without walls. And this brilliantly illustrates just how absurd their paranoia really was. For 3,000 years, the traditional Chinese standard was incredibly simple and clear. If you build an administrative or military center, you surround it with a massive, impenetrable wall. It's just basic logic, right? But the Qing Dynasty's policy for Taiwan? No walls whatsoever. The county seats, the government buildings, the military hubs, the whole shebang, all of them were left entirely open and completely unfortified. Why in the world would they do that? The answer is almost unbelievable. They deliberately didn't build walls because they wanted to make it easier for their own army to recapture the cities later. The Qing government assumed, as a matter of absolute certainty, that the corrupt officials and those lawless soldiers would eventually trigger a massive local rebellion. When the previous Tungnan kingdom surrendered, they did so largely because they had no walled cities to defend against the Qing naval entry into Tainan. The Qing wanted to keep that tactical advantage for themselves. They literally planned for their own administrative failure. It wasn't until the massive Zhuyugui rebellion of 1722 nearly wiped them out that they finally realized, okay, maybe this was a terrible idea, and finally changed the policy. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider this. The story of early Qing rule in Taiwan is a literal masterclass in human behavior and structural incentives. Think about it. If a system is specifically designed for short-term extraction, where leaders have no long-term stake, absolutely no accountability to the locals, and everything is driven entirely by paranoia, is corruption just a mere possibility, or is it an absolute mathematical guarantee? The architecture of distrust ultimately built exactly what it feared most. Thank you so much for doing me today, and hey, always keep questioning the structures around you.